Rainy, inclement weather might be the biggest reason why people stay home on the weekends and don't go do their excursions, their backpacking trips, their campouts. And there's a lot of fear about what to do, how to stay comfortable, how to stay dry, how to enjoy your camping, your backpacking experience in the rain. So today we are going to look at some tips to make sure that you are enjoying your experience and that you can get outside no matter what the weather is. Before we get into the video here, I would like to ask a quick favor. If you've been enjoying our video series, please like and subscribe to our channel. We want to get you outside as much as possible and enjoying it as much as possible, of course. Sometimes it's hard to predict what the weather is really gonna do. Yesterday I was out here setting up my camp in a beautiful sunshiny day, not a cloud in the sky, and yet still was having to prepare for what was going to happen because I knew that rain was in the forecast. So the first thing that I would recommend for people to do is to really take into account where their site selection is going to be when you get into camp, when you are done backpacking on the trail. In advance of rain, this is a lot of what we're talking about, is where you choose your site is going to go a long ways. So I thought I did a pretty good job here. I had chosen a slope. It's a couple of degrees that some of the water would be shed, but yet I still see that I've got a little lake here in the bottom corner of my tent, and that's obviously not desirable. It's not the worst thing in the world. These tents are going to be pretty good at keeping that water out, but you can tell how your site selection actually goes a long way to making sure that you're going to be enjoying yourself, because it was raining all night long, and you can see how it really started to accumulate here. So one of the things that I want to do is make sure that if something like this starts to happen, I'm going to probably need to dig some sort of trench to help that water start to drain away. And I don't want any sort of water just pooling up straight up under the tent, because that's eventually going to make its way through the tent and soak your tent. So one of the important things I think is that the tent site, the inside of your tent, that's really the only environment when you're backpacking or camping that you can really control. Everything else out here is wild, it's subject to nature, and the general landscape, you can't control how muddy, how wet, how gross everything gets. The only thing you can control is the tent. So making sure that we take the steps to control that environment so that the inside of your tent stays dry, so that you don't track a bunch of mud in there, and that you keep the water out. So let's look at a few other things here. When you first set up your tent, it's really important to actually get the rain fly really tight and stretched all the way around your tent. And what will happen is, as this fabric gets wet, it will have a tendency to sag. That's just the natural way that the materials of the fabric react to a lot of water as it saturates. So even though it's still shedding water, it's going to sag. And one of the things that we really do not want to have here is that the tent is going to start to touch the interior walls of your tent. So in your typical two-walled tent, this is a very common design. If this starts to sag, water will start to pool up, and any time that there's a connection point or just a contact point from the rain fly to the inside, that's where water is going to start to work its way through. So if you have on the top, it's not tight up here, and then that's sitting on top, that's eventually going to pool up and it's going to start dripping through into your tent. So when you're setting up your tent, really make sure that you have everything tight and stretched. All of your tent stakes are pulled out to their maximum width. Don't worry, the tent is designed to take that tension, and also if there's wind as well, that additional tension will really help give your tent additional structure. So you want that. You want it to look tight. And don't worry about ripping the tent. It can withstand that. One thing that I recommend is, even though I had set this up and put a lot of tension in the rain fly, it's still overnight, because there was so much rain, it started to sag. So I need to go, I might even have to get up in the middle of the night to do this. Obviously that's not ideal, but if you do start to see something happen, be proactive, get out and fix your tent. Because if you just cinch up the tensions again, as everything starts to relax, then you can recreate that tense point of your rain fly and then help give it that the dry factor, so that it continues to shed all of the rain. So just making sure that all of these things are basically going to be as tight as possible. And you might need to re-hammer in some of your tent stakes, because as it gets muddy, I was only able to drive in these tent stakes into the hard ground a little bit. And then as it got muddy, everything kind of helped saturate the ground, and then the tent stakes started to move in. As you can see here, there is a bunch of mud and grossness at the edge of, basically at the door of my tent. And so really maintaining your vestibule area is really important. So if I was going to be camping for another night, I would want to make sure that I was doing some things to give myself a cleaner area. I might find some branches, I might find some pine needles, some duff, and I might spread that out and try to soak up some of that water. I might dig a trench to try to lead some of the water away. But let's take a look at this inside the vestibule. Okay, so this space right here is your vestibule of your tent. And this is one of the main spaces that you have access to that's kind of in this in-between zone. It's not all the way outside and it's not inside your tent. So this is a two-person tent. If you have two people inside, it can be a challenge to also fit 2 pairs of backpacks and all of your gear inside. Depending on the amount of weather that's coming in, you might have to have all of your gear inside your tent and taking up your legroom. So you might not sleep as good, but it might be necessary, because look here, you can see how muddy this vestibule got. So if I was storing all of my gear out here in the night, depending on how I did it, if I was a little too carefree about it, then all of that water and mud is probably going to be all throughout my backpack. So oftentimes I definitely also recommend backpacking with a rain fly. And if I do have a good rain fly, then what I can also do is situate my backpack inside this vestibule area, with the rain fly being what's going to be on the contact with the ground. So that all of the rain and mud that collects in this area, it's really just going to be running off and not getting into my backpack, because the rain fly is creating that barrier for me. This one might be obvious, it may not be obvious, but my boots are obviously covered in mud, and I do not want to bring them inside my tent. It's really important for me to keep my interior of the tent totally clean and free from mud and moisture. And so I will just find really close to here. If I'm going into my tent, I'll take off my boots and I'll leave them here and let this vestibule area cover my boots. And if a little bit of extra moisture ends up getting inside, I am actually okay with that over bringing all this mud into my tent. That's not something I want to do. So leave your boots outside. And can be helpful if you know that you're going to be backpacking with a lot of rain. Maybe bring like a grocery bag or something like that you can then throw your boots into and help keep everything clean and dry. When you're actually settling in for the night and going to sleep and it's raining outside, one of the things that I definitely recommend is making sure that you have a minimum amount of things, and hopefully nothing, is touching the edges of your tent, especially at the foot of your tent where everything tends to get crammed and pushed. What will happen is that as you say your sleeping bag or maybe extra gear or your backpack or something like that is pushed against the tent, that's creating out, and the wall of the tent is actually then going to be touching the rain fly. And then as those points contact, the water will start to work its way into your tent. And so that is, even though this is waterproof, it still has a way to get into your tent. And so making sure that you are managing your stuff throughout the night so that if it's raining really heavily, you don't have a bunch of stuff that's just pushed against the foot of the tent, or maybe even the head of the tent, or anywhere. So any of those contact points, you want to reduce that to a minimum to hopefully none. A lot of people wonder what to do with their gear. My preference, of course, is to have everything inside the tent, because that's going to be the cleanest and driest. But if you have 2 people backpacking, that can be tricky. So again, then I would store stuff as best as possible in this vestibule area, even though some of that's going to get muddy. But mud on the outside of your backpack or on the outside of your rain fly is a lot less significant than mud on the inside of your tent. What happens if you do get a big pool of water inside your tent? Well, I like to backpack with like a quick dry towel, or sometimes if I don't have that, maybe I'll use a bandana, or if I don't even have that, maybe I'll use a shirt or like a t-shirt or something like that. But if there's water pooling up, I definitely don't want that getting into my sleeping bag or any of my clothes that I really care about. So I might need to actually mop up a puddle of water with a quick dry towel or bandana or something like that, and then just wring it out outside the tent. If you are setting up your tent in the rain, it can be really difficult to keep rain out of it because you don't have the rain fly set up in advance. And most of us don't then have the luxury of creating an additional shelter over top. So sometimes you just got to set it up in the rain and let the rain just fall onto the tent. And then you're going to have to, before you set up everything, before you lay out your sleeping bag, before you really undo all of your stuff, then mop up the inside of the tent, use a t-shirt, use a bandana, hopefully you have something like a quick dry towel, sop all that up, clean it up, and then you can lay out all of your stuff. So my preference would be to keep my backpacking gear actually in this vestibule area outside of the tent. But it's kind of a hot mess in here because there's so much mud that got pushed in. And then even though I did my best, there was so much rain that this area just became a muddy mud pile. So if I were to be choosing again, or where do you put your backpacking gear? You can either put it in the mud, or I'm going to try to put it here. Again, trying not to keep it all the way pushed against the wall so that I'm not bringing water into the tent. But then it might just be necessary that as I sleep here throughout the night, I just have to deal with a backpack at my feet. It's not ideal to have your gear inside your tent like this, but it is better than just having everything getting muddy and nasty. So especially if you're having two people in your tent and you just don't have anywhere else to put the stuff. So it's not ideal, but sometimes you just have to deal with conditions as they are, and it makes you a stronger person. One other note on your tent is that most tents will also have some additional points to create tension. So here is one, for example. I didn't even set it up last night, but I should have, where I put and basically create an anchor to pull this away. And this will give me additional space so that this doesn't sit against the tent here and likely have the ability to bring water into my tent by just sitting against the tent. This is still pretty this is still pretty tight, so it actually kept everything good. But if this was going to be a continuing rainstorm and just really settling in for a big long haul of a storm, I would make sure that I'm using all of these points to pull them out and create as dry and as good of an environment as I can. Having dry clothes is a really important part of the backpacking experience, and also safety. Not only is it just uncomfortable to be wet, it can also be a little bit unsafe if you're constantly wet. This is one of the reasons why I definitely do not recommend that anybody do any real backpacking with cotton clothing. When cotton clothing gets wet, it just holds onto that moisture and never dries, and it stays against your skin. The moisture will stay against your skin and it will basically just sap all of your energy, all of your heat away from your skin. And that is something that you definitely do not want. So that is why moisture wicking clothing is really important. That's why when you go into REI or any of these stores, you see all these clothes that are super expensive. And it's because it's technical fabric and it can actually do some cool things with water. So having things like moisture wicking, fast dry, quick dry clothing, the type of shirts that runners would run in, fleeces, things like that, or synthetic jackets. Like this jacket here is a synthetic jacket as opposed to a down jacket. Those are clothing items that I definitely recommend if you know that it's going to be rainy outside. And then obviously having a good rain shell and rain pants is really important. So a lot of times I'm just backpacking full on with rain pants, with a rain jacket, and then hopefully Gore-Tex waterproof boots as well. If it's just raining all day throughout the night and, just 6 days of rain, it's inevitable that you are going to get wet under your rain shells. It's just going to happen. So some things that you can do to minimize that, obviously just wearing your clothing right is important, but then what happens if those clothes do get wet? So Having a change of clothes is great. That's why I advocate for having a pair of clothes that's just for sleeping, so that when you go into your sleeping bag at night, you have dry clothes that you're comfortable in. And some things like socks and underwear, I would recommend not wearing those into the sleeping bag, but if they're wet and you want to be hiking in them the next day, put them into your sleeping bag, and you will actually be a dryer, a heater. And that sleeping bag is probably one of the few places that you can really dry stuff out in a wet environment. So you can use your sleeping bag to your advantage and have it dry out some other wet items, clothing especially. But otherwise, if it's just like a t-shirt, maybe I have 2 or 3 pairs that I can interchange for them, just having those set aside in your tent, and then I'd rather put on a wet shirt to hike in and hopefully dry out throughout the day. There are some other tips that you can do. Sometimes I like to hike with socks on the shoulder area underneath my jacket, as my body heat will actually dry off some of those. So if some of these smaller items. So if you need to dry something out, using your body warmth as a method of drying those out can be effective. So it's going to be about time for me to break camp here, and unfortunately I won't be able to wait around for everything to dry out. There's another rain cell that's on its way, and so sometimes you just have to pack up with everything being wet. So what I would do in this case is that I would make sure that I'm packing up everything inside of the dry space that I have. So packing up my sleeping bag, packing up my sleeping mattress, packing up all my clothes into my backpack, and then last I'm going to hold off and I'm going to unpack or pack up my tent. Now it's inevitable that the tent is going to be wet as I pack it up, and there's just kind of nothing you can do about it. So hopefully as I get to camp next, I'll be able to set that up and hopefully dry out. Hopefully I can get some sunshine early and dry out before I put display my gear inside that tent again. But sometimes it's just you're managing the moisture as best you can throughout the experience. However, if you are going to be packing up and going home, then I definitely recommend, one, just pack it up. Don't worry that it's going to be covered in mud. Don't worry about that it's going to be covered in, everything's going to be wet. Take it home, but this is the critical part. Do not forget about it and just throw it in your garage and leave it for 6 months, because the next time you use it, that thing will be a nasty mess that is full of mildew and grossness that actually can really wreck your tent. So do not do that, because not only is it unpleasant, but it can really damage the fabric and the materials and the waterproofness of your tent. So make sure that when you get home, you actually are rolling it out. Use your garage if it's still wet. Use whatever you can. Hang it up. Hang up your stuff. Hang up all of your gear, your sleeping bag, your clothes, your backpack, and make sure that it's airing out before you actually put it away for its final destination. Maybe it's in the attic, maybe it's, in your closet or wherever you're putting your stuff. Make sure that it's dried out before you store it for a long period of time. So it's been raining pretty steadily for the last 8 or 9 hours. Everything is just a muddy mess out here, but I did want to show I've packed up the inside of my tent, and so the only thing that remains is a dry interior. So if you take the steps that we learned here today, this can be what you experience. Even if it's raining and downpouring outside, you can still have a nice, cozy, warm tent space in which to stay dry and to stay comfortable. And yeah, so now it's time to pack this up, and the only thing that I can do is, despite the fact that everything's going to be covered in mud, I'm going to pack it up, and then when I get to my next spot, I'm going to dry everything out and open everything up and give it a chance to breathe, and then do it again. One thing I'll mention as I'm packing up my tent here, I've got a little weather window. So I'm going to pull the rain fly off. And I'm going to try to set this as best I can in a place where it's going to stay relatively clean. So I'm going to use this little bush temporarily as a dry space. And now I'll pack up the rest, and then I'll deal with that later. But that helps me keep everything as clean and dry as possible. The good thing to remember when you're out here is that this will dry and this will just turn into dust and you can just wipe it off. So little mud is not to be feared. Backpacking in the rain can actually be quite enjoyable. Usually the trails and campsites empty out and no one is out there, and you get spectacular sights. Like right now, these clouds are just doing really cool things on the rocks behind me here. And I wouldn't be able to get to witness that if I was staying at home just watching Netflix or something like that. And how boring would that be? So I definitely advocate for getting out and participating in our wild spaces, even in inclement weather. You can do it, and then you won't even know how tough and badass you really feel by going through these experiences. So get out there, take these tips, and be prepared. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Eric Hansen. I hope you found this helpful. Please like and subscribe to our videos, and stay tuned for more tips that'll help you get out there and doing it more and enjoying it better. I'm Eric Hansen. This is Backpacking TV. See you later. Peace.